The baton came down hard across his shoulders, sending him stumbling against the White House fence. "Don't move, suspect," Officer Michael Brooks yelled, pressing his knee into Ethan Walker's back on the sidewalk, where tourists watched in horror. None of them knew they were witnessing the assault of the Secret Service director, the man whose job it was to protect this very building. "Which state are you from? Have you ever witnessed a badge being used as a weapon instead of protection?" The morning had started like any other Tuesday in Washington, D.C. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and Pennsylvania Avenue hummed with its usual mixture of commuters, tourists, and the ever-present undercurrent of power that flows through the nation's capital like an invisible river. Street vendors called out their offerings of coffee and newspapers, while groups of visitors clustered around tour guides who spoke in practiced cadences about democracy and freedom. Ethan Walker had been walking that same stretch of sidewalk for 3 years, ever since his appointment as Director of the United States Secret Service. Today, like most days, he wore civilian clothes, a well-tailored brown trench coat over dark slacks, and polished shoes that spoke of quality without ostentation. At 52, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had earned his position through decades of service, starting as a field agent and working his way up through every level of the organization. He had left his official car 6 blocks away, as was his habit. The walk to the White House gave him time to think, to observe, to see his domain through fresh eyes. It was a practice he had learned from his predecessor, a woman who had taught him that leadership meant understanding your environment from every angle, including the perspective of those you protect and those who might threaten them. The irony was not lost on him that he often passed unrecognized by the very tourists he helped keep safe. His face wasn't plastered on magazine covers or cable news shows. The Secret Service preferred it that way. Anonymity was both a tool and a shield in his line of work. Most Americans had no idea what the director of the Secret Service looked like, and that was exactly how it should be. But Officer Michael Brooks of the Metropolitan Police Department had his own ideas about who belonged near the White House and who didn't. Brooks had been patrolling this beat for 8 months, ever since his transfer from a quieter precinct in Southeast D.C. He was 34 years old, built like a linebacker, and carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed his badge gave him unlimited authority. His uniform was always pressed, his shoes always shined, but there was something in his eyes that suggested his commitment to law and order was more about the order part than the law. He had been watching Ethan Walker for 3 blocks. Something about the black man in the expensive coat bothered him. The way he walked with purpose, but without hurry. The way he seemed to take in everything around him with the calm assessment of someone who belonged. The way tourists and locals alike seemed to give him space without even realizing they were doing it. Brooks had radioed for backup twice in those 3 blocks, describing a suspicious individual conducting surveillance near federal buildings. His supervisor had told him to keep watching, but take no action without probable cause. But Brooks had never been good at taking orders he didn't like. When Ethan Walker paused near the White House fence to check his phone, a secure device that connected him directly to the Presidential Protection Detail, Brooks saw his opportunity. The first blow came without warning. The expandable baton caught Ethan between the shoulder blades, with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. He stumbled forward, his phone clattering to the sidewalk as his hands instinctively reached out to catch himself against the white-painted iron bars of the fence. "Don't move, suspect," Brooks roared, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from a badge rather than respect. "Get your hands where I can see them." Around them, the steady flow of foot traffic came to an abrupt halt. A tour group of elderly visitors from Ohio froze in place, their guide's voice trailing off mid-sentence about the Rose Garden. A family with 2 young children quickly pulled back, the mother instinctively shielding her kids while the father fumbled for his phone. Ethan Walker slowly turned around, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. His brown trench coat had torn slightly from the impact, and there was a growing stain on the shoulder where the baton had struck. But his expression remained calm, almost contemplative, as if he was solving a complex problem rather than being assaulted by a police officer. "Officer," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite the growing crowd. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Brooks stepped closer, his baton still raised, his free hand hovering near his service weapon. "The only misunderstanding is you thinking you can case this place without consequences. What's your business here?" "I work nearby," Ethan replied simply. It was the truth, though perhaps not the whole truth. "Work?" Brooks laughed, a harsh sound that carried more contempt than humor. "Doing what? Security guard? Janitor?" His eyes raked over Ethan's appearance, taking in the quality of his clothes, but interpreting them through the lens of his own prejudices. "Or maybe you're just another con man, trying to work the tourist crowd." The family with children had their phones out now, recording. The father held his device steady, despite his obvious nervousness, while his wife whispered urgently for him to put it away. Their teenage daughter had already started live streaming, her thumb moving rapidly across her screen as she typed commentary for her followers. A businessman in a charcoal suit had stopped pretending to read his newspaper and was openly watching the confrontation. A group of college students on their spring break trip to DC clustered together, some recording, others just staring in shock at the scene unfolding before them. Ethan Walker remained perfectly still, his hands visible, his posture non-confrontational. But there was something in his eyes, a depth of knowledge, a weight of responsibility that suggested he was cataloging every detail of this encounter for reasons that went far beyond personal safety. "Officer," he said again, his tone remaining calm despite the growing crowd and the weapon pointed in his direction. "I'm going to reach slowly into my coat pocket to show you my identification." "Don't you move," Brooks snapped, taking another step forward. The tip of his baton was now inches from Ethan's chest. "You reach for anything and you'll be eating pavement." This was the moment that would later be analyzed by internal affairs investigators, reviewed by federal prosecutors, and dissected by civil rights attorneys. This was the moment when Officer Michael Brooks made a choice that would define the rest of his career and ultimately destroy it. Instead of allowing Ethan Walker to produce identification, instead of following the de-escalation protocols he had learned in the academy, instead of recognizing that the man before him posed no threat to anyone, Brooks grabbed Ethan by the shoulder and spun him around. The brown trench coat twisted as Ethan was forced against the fence, his palms pressing against the cold iron bars as Brooks kicked his feet apart. The sound of the impact echoed off the surrounding buildings, mixing with the gasps and murmurs of the growing crowd. "Hands on the fence, spread your legs," Brooks commanded, his voice now carrying the kind of aggression that comes from adrenaline and unchecked power. "You so much as twitch, and I'll put you down." Ethan complied with every instruction, his movements careful and controlled. But even as he pressed his palms against the White House fence, the same fence he had helped design security improvements for just 6 months earlier, his mind was working. He was calculating response times for his own protective detail, who would have been alerted the moment his secure phone hit the ground. He was considering the diplomatic implications of a federal law enforcement director being assaulted in full view of international tourists. He was thinking about the 17-year-old girl who was broadcasting this encounter live to her 3,000 followers, and how that video would ripple outward through social media like concentric circles in still water. But mostly, he was thinking about how this moment would be used, how it would become a teaching tool, a case study, a reminder that the very people sworn to serve and protect could become the greatest threat to the values they claimed to defend. Brooks began his search, his hands rough and invasive as they moved across Ethan's body. The trench coat was expensive. That much was obvious even to someone with Brooks's limited fashion sense. The fabric was quality wool, tailored to fit perfectly. Underneath, Ethan wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Brooks made in a month. In the inside pocket of the coat, Brooks found a wallet. Leather, understated, containing several credit cards with names that meant nothing to him and a driver's license that identified the man as Ethan Michael Walker, age 52, address listed as Arlington, Virginia. "What's your business in D.C., Mr. Walker?" Brooks asked, his tone suggesting that the question was a formality, rather than a genuine inquiry. "As I mentioned, I work nearby," Ethan replied. His voice was steady, but there was something new in it now. A subtle shift that suggested patience wearing thin. Brooks found something else in the coat pocket, a small rectangular case. Black leather with a subtle embossed seal. He flipped it open without thinking, expecting to find business cards or perhaps a company ID. What he found instead made him pause. The ID was unlike anything he had seen before. Federal, clearly, but with security features that seemed to shift in the light. The photograph was definitely Ethan Walker, but the information below it was partially obscured by what looked like a holographic overlay. Brooks could make out Department of Homeland Security and what might have been a clearance level, but the rest seemed to blur whenever he tried to focus on it. For just a moment, doubt crept into his mind. Federal ID meant federal employee. Federal employee might mean federal oversight. Federal oversight might mean complications. But then he looked around at the crowd that had gathered, at the phones recording his every move, at the scene he had created in full view of one of the most photographed buildings in America. Backing down now would look weak. Admitting a mistake would suggest incompetence. And besides, how important could one black man really be? "Fake ID," he announced loudly, snapping the case shut and pocketing it, probably trying to impersonate a federal officer. The murmur from the crowd grew louder. Several people shifted uncomfortably, and the businessman in the charcoal suit pulled out his own phone to start recording. A woman in a red jacket whispered urgently to her companion, "This doesn't look right." Ethan Walker said nothing. He remained pressed against the fence, his palms flat against the iron bars, his eyes focused on something beyond the White House lawn. To the casual observer, he might have appeared resigned or defeated, but there was something in his stillness that suggested a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Brooks pulled out his handcuffs, the metal catching the sunlight as he prepared to make his arrest. "Ethan Walker, you're under arrest for disorderly conduct, possession of fraudulent identification, and suspicion of conducting surveillance of a federal facility." As the cuffs clicked into place around Ethan's wrists, somewhere in the basement of the White House, a computer system registered an anomaly. The secure phone that had clattered to the sidewalk contained a GPS tracker, and that tracker had just gone stationary in an unexpected location for longer than protocol allowed. Within 30 seconds, alerts began cascading through multiple federal agencies. Within 2 minutes, a duty officer at Secret Service headquarters was reaching for a secure phone to make a call that would change everything. But Officer Michael Brooks knew none of this. He saw only what he wanted to see, a suspicious black man who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, now properly subdued and about to be processed through a system that, in his experience, rarely asked uncomfortable questions about how arrests were made. As he guided his handcuffed prisoner toward his patrol car, Brooks failed to notice the unmarked sedan that had quietly pulled to the curb half a block away. He didn't see the driver speaking urgently into a radio, or the way pedestrians seemed to be giving the area a wider berth than usual. He was about to learn that some mistakes cannot be undone, and some people cannot be arrested without consequences that ripple far beyond what any badge can protect against. The walk to the patrol car took less than a minute, but it would be replayed thousands of times over the next few hours as the teenager's live stream was shared, screenshot, and dissected across every social media platform imaginable. By evening, White House brutality would be trending worldwide, and Officer Michael Brooks would become the face of everything wrong with American policing. But that was still in the future. For now, he was just a cop who had made what he believed to be a righteous arrest, completely unaware that he had just handcuffed one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the United States government. The patrol car's engine hummed with the idle authority of law enforcement. As Officer Michael Brooks opened the rear door, the back seat smelled of disinfectant and desperation, a cocktail of cleaning chemicals that couldn't quite mask the lingering fear of everyone who had sat there before. Ethan Walker paused for just a moment at the threshold, his brown trench coat now bearing the dirt and scuff marks of his encounter with the White House fence. "Get in," Brooks commanded, his hand pressing firmly against the top of Ethan's head as he guided him into the vehicle. The handcuffs bit into Ethan's wrists as he settled into the hard plastic seat, but his expression remained as calm as still water. Brooks slammed the door with more force than necessary, the sound echoing off the surrounding buildings like a gunshot. As he walked around to the driver's side, he failed to notice the growing crowd of onlookers, many of whom were no longer content to simply watch. Phones were out everywhere now, recording not just the arrest, but Brooks himself, his swagger, his casual brutality, his complete confidence in his own righteousness. The live stream that had started with a 17-year-old girl from Michigan had now been shared 47 times in the past 6 minutes. Her follower count was climbing as people tuned in to watch what she was breathlessly describing as police brutality happening right now at the White House. The comments section was exploding with outrage, questions and demands for someone to call the media. But Brooks remained blissfully unaware of the digital wildfire he had sparked. He climbed into the driver's seat, adjusted his rearview mirror, and picked up his radio to call in the arrest. "Unit 47 to dispatch," he said, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a job well done. "I have one in custody. Black male, approximately 50 years old, arrested for disorderly conduct, possession of fraudulent federal identification, and suspicious activity near the White House perimeter." The voice that crackled back through the radio carried a note of wariness. Dispatcher Sarah Martinez had been working the downtown beat for 12 years, and something about this call felt off. "Unit 47, can you repeat the charges? Did you say fraudulent federal ID?" "That's affirmative, dispatch." Subject was carrying what appears to be a fake Department of Homeland Security identification card, probably trying to gain unauthorized access to federal property. There was a pause on the other end of the radio, longer than usual. "Unit 47, have you run the ID through federal verification systems?" Brooks glanced in his rearview mirror at Ethan, who sat perfectly still, his eyes focused on something beyond the window. "Negative, dispatch. ID is obviously counterfeit. Poor quality, blurry text, probably made on a home printer." What Brooks couldn't know was that the ID he had dismissed so casually contained security features that existed in fewer than 200 identification cards in the entire United States. The holographic overlay that he had interpreted as poor craftsmanship was actually a multi-layered security system that could only be verified through classified federal databases. The blurry text he had seen was dynamic encryption that changed based on viewing angle and ambient light conditions. And in the basement of a nondescript federal building 6 miles away, that ID had already been flagged as belonging to someone whose arrest would trigger immediate alerts across multiple intelligence agencies. "Unit 47, the dispatcher's voice came back, more cautious now. "I'm showing some unusual flags in the system. Can you provide a more detailed description of the subject?" Brooks was growing impatient. He had made a good arrest, probably prevented some kind of terrorist surveillance, and now dispatch was second-guessing him with bureaucratic nonsense. "Subject is Ethan Walker, black male, well-dressed, approximately 6 feet tall, brown trench coat, claims to work nearby, but was clearly conducting surveillance." In the back seat, Ethan almost smiled. If Brooks had bothered to look more carefully at the ID he had confiscated, he would have noticed that it contained not just Ethan's name and photograph, but also a small notation that read, "Protectee status, presidential." He would have seen clearance levels that existed only for individuals whose safety was considered vital to national security. But Brooks saw only what his prejudices allowed him to see. The radio crackled again. "Unit 47, I need you to hold your position. Do not transport the subject until I can verify some information." "Negative, dispatch. I'm bringing him in for processing. Subject has been cooperative, but I don't want to give him time to contact any associates who might be part of this operation." Brooks turned off the radio before dispatch could respond and put the car in drive. As they pulled away from the curb, he glanced in his rearview mirror one more time. "You picked the wrong day to test the wrong cop," he told Ethan conversationally. "Hope whatever you were planning was worth it, because you're looking at serious federal time." Ethan finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that Brooks was too arrogant to recognize. "Officer Brooks, I strongly suggest you contact your supervisor before proceeding further." Brooks laughed. "Oh, so now you want to cooperate? Little late for that, don't you think?" He turned onto Constitution Avenue, heading toward the downtown precinct. "Besides, how do you know my name? I didn't introduce myself." "It's on your nameplate," Ethan replied simply. But that wasn't entirely true. Ethan knew Brooks's name because he had been briefed on every police officer who worked the White House perimeter. As director of the Secret Service, he received weekly reports on all local law enforcement personnel who might interact with federal security operations. He knew that Brooks had been transferred from Southeast D.C. after a series of complaints about excessive force. He knew about the anger management classes Brooks had been ordered to attend. He knew about the 2 prior incidents involving racial profiling that had been quietly settled to avoid litigation. What he didn't know was why those red flags hadn't prevented Brooks from being assigned to one of the most sensitive security zones in the nation's capital. As they drove through downtown Washington, Ethan's trained eye cataloged everything: the pedestrian traffic patterns, the positioning of street vendors, the locations of security cameras. It was an automatic process, ingrained by decades of protective work. But today, it served a different purpose. Today, he was gathering evidence. Brooks, meanwhile, was planning his report. He would write it up as a textbook case of proactive policing. Suspicious individual identified, proper procedures followed, potential threat neutralized. He might even get a commendation for preventing whatever plot this Ethan Walker had been planning. The irony was breathtaking in its completeness. 3 blocks from the precinct, Brooks' radio came to life with an urgency he had never heard before. All units, be advised. Federal agencies are requesting immediate notification of any arrests involving individuals with Department of Homeland Security identification. Repeat, any DHS ID holders arrested in the past hour must be verified through federal channels before processing. Brooks reached for the radio to acknowledge, then stopped. If he responded, dispatch would order him to return to the scene for verification. There would be paperwork, delays, questions he didn't want to answer about his arrest procedures. Better to complete the transport and let the desk sergeant sort out any federal issues later. He turned the radio volume down and continued driving. In the back seat, Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He was thinking about his wife, Dr. Patricia Walker, who was probably in surgery at George Washington University Hospital, unaware that her husband was currently handcuffed in the back of a police car. He was thinking about his 18-year-old daughter, Maya, who was a freshman at Howard University and would likely see news of this arrest on social media before anyone could explain the situation to her. But mostly, he was thinking about the systemic failures that had led to this moment. The background check failures that had put Brooks on White House duty. The training deficiencies that had allowed racial bias to override basic police procedures. The supervisory gaps that had let multiple warnings about Brooks' conduct go unaddressed. As director of the Secret Service, Ethan was responsible for protecting the president, the vice president, and their families. But his mandate extended beyond personal protection. He was also responsible for maintaining the integrity of federal security operations. And that meant ensuring that local law enforcement partners met the highest standards of professionalism and competence. Officer Michael Brooks represented everything that was wrong with that partnership. The downtown precinct came into view, a gray concrete building that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed that justice should feel as grim as possible. Brooks pulled into the garage, the overhead door closing behind them with a mechanical groan that seemed to seal Ethan's fate. "End of the line," Brooks announced cheerfully as he turned off the engine. "Hope you enjoyed the ride, because the next one's going to be in a federal transport van." As Brooks opened the rear door, Ethan stepped out of the patrol car with the same calm dignity he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. His brown trench coat was wrinkled and stained. His expensive shoes were scuffed from being forced against the fence, but his bearing remained unbroken. The booking sergeant, a 20-year veteran named Tom Rodriguez, looked up from his paperwork as Brooks escorted his prisoner through the garage entrance. Rodriguez had seen thousands of arrests in his career, and he had developed an instinct for trouble. Something about this particular arrest made his internal alarms start ringing. Maybe it was the way the prisoner carried himself, not with the defeated slump of someone caught in a crime, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where he stood in the world. Maybe it was the quality of his clothes, which suggested someone with resources and connections. Or maybe it was the way Brooks was practically bouncing with excitement, like a rookie who had just made his first major collar. In Rodriguez's experience, cops only got that excited when they were about to discover they had made a very big mistake. "What have we got, Brooks?" Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying the weary authority of someone who had processed more arrests than he cared to count. "Domestic terrorist, Sarge," Brooks replied proudly. "Caught him conducting surveillance of the White House with fake federal ID, probably part of some kind of cell." Rodriguez's eyebrows went up. In 20 years, he had never heard anyone describe surveillance and fake ID as domestic terrorism. Those were serious charges, the kind that brought federal investigators and uncomfortable questions about arrest procedures. "Did you verify the ID through federal systems?" Rodriguez asked, already knowing the answer. "Didn't need to, Sarge. Thing was obviously fake. Poor quality, probably made at home." Rodriguez looked at Ethan, who met his gaze steadily. There was something in those eyes that made the veteran sergeant deeply uncomfortable, a sense of intelligence and awareness that didn't match the profile of someone stupid enough to conduct surveillance of the White House with obviously fake identification. "What's your name, sir?" Rodriguez asked Ethan directly. "Ethan Michael Walker," came the calm reply. "And Sergeant, I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding." The way he said Sergeant, not with the bitter sarcasm of a criminal or the desperate pleading of someone in trouble, but with the easy familiarity of someone accustomed to working with law enforcement, sent another chill down Rodriguez's spine. "Brooks," Rodriguez said slowly, "I think we need to make some phone calls before we process this arrest." But before Brooks could respond, the phone on Rodriguez's desk rang with the sharp, insistent tone reserved for priority calls. The sergeant picked it up, listened for a moment, then went very pale. "Yes, sir," he said into the phone. "Yes, sir. We have him here." "No, sir. He hasn't been processed yet." "Yes, sir. I understand. We'll wait for your arrival." Rodriguez hung up the phone and looked at Brooks with an expression that mixed pity with professional dread. "Brooks," he said quietly, "you need to remove those handcuffs right now." "What?" "Sarge, this guy is—" "That was the chief of police," Rodriguez interrupted, "and he's on his way down here personally, along with some federal representatives who are very, very interested in talking to Mr. Walker." The booking area fell silent, except for the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the muffled sounds of the city beyond the precinct walls. Brooks looked confused, then angry, then slowly, terrifyingly concerned. Ethan Walker simply stood there, patient as stone, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally catch up with Officer Michael Brooks' arrogance. That moment was now less than 10 minutes away. The booking area of the downtown precinct had the institutional atmosphere of a place where hope went to die. Harsh fluorescent lights cast everything in a sickly pallor, while the smell of industrial disinfectant fought a losing battle against decades of accumulated human desperation. Metal chairs bolted to concrete floors created an echo that turned every conversation into a public announcement, and the constant buzz of activity, phones ringing, keyboards clacking, officers moving with purposeful urgency, formed a symphony of bureaucratic chaos. Ethan Walker stood in the center of it all, with his hands still cuffed behind his back, as calm as the eye of a hurricane. His brown trench coat, now bearing the evidence of his encounter with the White House fence, hung slightly askew, but his posture remained erect. To anyone watching, he might have appeared to be a man resigned to his fate, but Sergeant Tom Rodriguez, with his 20 years of experience reading people, recognized something else entirely: the patience of a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. Officer Michael Brooks, meanwhile, was beginning to experience the first stirrings of doubt. The phone call that had made Rodriguez go pale, the sudden urgency in everyone's movements, the way other officers kept glancing in their direction with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern, None of it fit the narrative he had constructed in his mind about making a routine arrest of a suspicious individual. "Sarge," Brooks said, his voice carrying a forced casualness that didn't quite hide his growing unease. "What exactly did the chief say?" Rodriguez was busy at his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he ran searches through multiple databases. What he was finding there was making him increasingly uncomfortable. The name Ethan Walker was returning hits in federal systems that required clearances he didn't have. Partial information was trickling through, but everything above a certain classification level was blacked out or marked access denied. He said to sit tight and wait. Rodriguez replied without looking up from his screen. "And Brooks?" He specifically said not to process the arrest until he gets here. The words hung in the air like a threat. In Rodriguez's experience, chiefs of police didn't personally respond to routine bookings. They didn't interrupt their schedules to deal with misdemeanor arrests, and they certainly didn't bring federal representatives along unless something had gone very, very wrong. Across the booking area, Detective Lisa Chen was trying to piece together the social media explosion that had started with Brooks's arrest. The live stream from the Michigan teenager had now been viewed over 15,000 times, and the hashtag White House brutality was trending in 3 major cities. News outlets were starting to pick up the story, and Chen had fielded 6 calls in the past 10 minutes from reporters asking for official comment on the violent arrest of an unidentified black man near the White House. "Brooks," Chen called out, her voice tight with concern. "Did you read this guy his rights?" Brooks looked confused. "He's not being questioned, detective. Just transported and booked." "That's not what I asked. Did you Mirandize him?" The question hit Brooks like a physical blow. In his excitement over making what he believed to be a significant arrest, in his rush to transport his prisoner before dispatch could interfere with his procedures, he had forgotten one of the most basic requirements of police work. He had never read Ethan Walker his Miranda rights. There wasn't time," Brooks stammered. "He wasn't being questioned, so—" "Jesus Christ, Brooks," Chen muttered, returning to her phone calls. The procedural violations were adding up, and each one would be scrutinized if this case went sideways. Ethan Walker listened to this exchange with the detached interest of someone observing a training exercise. He had spent 30 years in federal law enforcement, starting as a field agent with the Secret Service's Financial Crimes Division and working his way up through every level of the organization. He had seen good police work and bad police work, and he understood the difference between honest mistakes and willful negligence. What Officer Brooks had done went far beyond honest mistakes. The door to the booking area opened with electronic buzz, and Captain Robert Hayes strode in with the purposeful gait of someone accustomed to command. Hayes was a 40-year veteran who had worked his way up from beat cop to precinct captain, and his reputation for fairness and competence had earned him respect throughout the department. But today, his face carried the grim expression of someone dealing with a crisis. "Rodriguez," Hayes called out, "where are we with the Walker situation?" "Still waiting for federal verification, Captain. The ID is complicated." Hayes glanced at Ethan, taking in his appearance and demeanor with the practiced eye of someone who had processed thousands of arrests. What he saw didn't match the profile Brooks had radioed in. The man standing before him carried himself with quiet authority. His clothes spoke of success and stability, and his calm reaction to being arrested suggested either complete innocence or complete confidence in his eventual vindication. "Mr. Walker," Hayes said directly, "I apologize for the delay. We're working to clarify some issues with your identification." Ethan nodded slightly. "I understand, Captain. These things happen." The casual acceptance of the situation, the lack of anger or indignation that Hayes would have expected from an innocent man wrongly arrested, sent up red flags throughout his experienced mind. This wasn't how people reacted to being falsely accused of terrorism-related charges, unless they knew something the rest of them didn't. Brooks was growing increasingly agitated. The arrest that had seemed so clear-cut an hour ago was becoming complicated in ways he didn't understand. "Captain, this individual was conducting obvious surveillance of the White House with fraudulent federal identification. The threat assessment is clear." Hayes turned to look at Brooks, and the younger officer was surprised by the coldness in his superior's eyes. "Officer Brooks, walk me through your arrest procedures, step by step." The request sounded routine, but Brooks could hear the undertone of scrutiny. He began recounting the events, starting with his observation of Ethan's suspicious behavior and continuing through the physical confrontation and arrest. As he spoke, Hayes's expression grew increasingly grim. "You used your baton," Hayes interrupted. "Subject was non-compliant and potentially dangerous." "In what way was he non-compliant?" Brooks hesitated. In retrospect, Ethan Walker had followed every instruction, cooperated with every command, and shown no signs of resistance or aggression. He was evasive about his purpose in the area. Evasive how? He claimed to work nearby, but wouldn't specify where. Hayes looked at Ethan again. "Mr. Walker, do you work nearby?" "Yes, Captain, I do." "May I ask where?" Ethan's slight smile carried no humor. "I'm not sure you have clearance for that information." The words dropped into the booking area like stones into still water, creating ripples of confusion and concern. Rodriguez looked up from his computer with alarm, while Brooks' face flushed red with anger. "Are you threatening a police captain?" Brooks demanded. "Not at all," Ethan replied calmly. "I'm simply noting that my work involves classified information that requires specific security clearances to discuss." The electronic buzz of the door interrupted the conversation, and everyone turned to see Chief of Police Margaret Stone enter the booking area. Stone was a 30-year veteran who had risen through the ranks by combining political savvy with genuine police competence. She commanded respect throughout the department and fear among those who crossed her. Behind her walked two individuals who immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. The first was a woman in her 40s, wearing a conservative business suit and carrying a briefcase that suggested federal employment. The second was a man whose bearing and demeanor screamed military, despite his civilian clothes. "Captain Hayes," Chief Stone said without preamble, "I need to speak with you privately." Now, Hayes followed her to a corner of the booking area, and their conversation consisted of urgent whispers, punctuated by occasional glances toward Ethan Walker. Brooks couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see Hayes's face growing pale as Stone continued talking. The woman with the briefcase approached Rodriguez's desk. "Sergeant, I'm Special Agent Catherine Morrison, Department of Homeland Security. I need to see the identification and any other materials confiscated from Mr. Walker." Rodriguez looked to Captain Hayes, who nodded grimly. The sergeant opened his evidence locker and retrieved the black leather ID case that Brooks had dismissed as obviously fraudulent. Agent Morrison examined the ID with equipment from her briefcase, devices that Brooks had never seen before, scanners that seemed to read information invisible to the naked eye. Her examination lasted less than 2 minutes, but when she finished, her expression was grim. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "this identification is authentic, extremely authentic. The security features alone indicate a clearance level that exists for fewer than 200 individuals in the entire federal government." The booking area fell silent. Even the background noise of phones and keyboards seemed to fade as the implications of Morrison's words sank in. Brooks felt the world shifting beneath his feet. That's impossible. The ID was obviously fake. The text was blurry. The photo quality was poor. Morrison turned to look at him with the kind of clinical interest usually reserved for laboratory specimens. "Officer Brooks, the features you interpreted as poor quality are actually dynamic security measures that cost more to implement than most people make in a year. The blurry text you mentioned is quantum encryption that changes based on biometric readings from the person examining it." The man with military bearing stepped forward. "Colonel James Patterson, Joint Chiefs of Staff." "Mr. Walker, sir, we received the alert from your security detail 23 minutes ago. Are you injured?" The title "sir" hung in the air like an accusation. Military officers didn't use that form of address casually, and certainly not to civilians unless those civilians held positions of significant authority. Ethan shook his head slightly. "Nothing serious, Colonel. Some bruising from the baton strike, but no lasting damage." Baton strike. Morrison's voice carried a sharp edge. You struck him with a baton. Brooks was beginning to understand that he had wandered into a minefield without realizing it. He was non-compliant. Standard crowd control procedures. Standard procedures. Colonel Patterson's voice could have cut steel. You used a weapon against a federal official? Chief Stone finished her whispered conversation with Captain Hayes and approached the group. Her face was the color of old paper, and her hands were shaking slightly. Officer Brooks, she said, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years of police work. You are suspended from duty effective immediately. You will surrender your weapon, your badge, and all department equipment. A formal investigation will begin within the hour. Brooks stared at her in shock. Chief, I don't understand. I made a good arrest. I prevented a possible terrorist attack on the White House. Stone's laugh was bitter and entirely without humor. Officer Brooks, the man you arrested, is Ethan Walker, Director of the United States Secret Service. You didn't prevent a terrorist attack. You committed assault against one of the highest-ranking law enforcement officials in the federal government. The words hit Brooks like a physical blow. He looked at Ethan Walker, really looked at him for the first time, and saw not a suspicious individual or a potential terrorist, but a man whose calm confidence now made perfect sense, a man who had known from the first moment exactly how this encounter would end. That's not possible, Brooks whispered. Agent Morrison was already working to remove Ethan's handcuffs. Mr. Director, on behalf of the Department of Homeland Security, I apologize for this incident. We're prepared to take whatever action you deem appropriate. Ethan rubbed his wrists as the cuffs came off, his brown trench coat hanging loose around his shoulders. For the first time since his arrest, he looked directly at Officer Michael Brooks, and there was something in his eyes that made the younger man take an involuntary step backward. Officer Brooks, Ethan said quietly, I want you to understand something. I don't hold grudges. I don't seek personal revenge. But I also don't ignore systemic failures that put American security at risk. He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. Your arrest of me today wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. It was the result of racial profiling, excessive force, procedural violations, and a fundamental failure to follow basic police protocols. Those failures represent a threat to every operation my agency conducts, and I cannot allow such threats to go unaddressed. Brooks opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The magnitude of his mistake was finally becoming clear, and the weight of it was crushing. Chief Stone stepped forward. Mr. Director, please accept my personal apology and the apology of the entire Metropolitan Police Department. Officer Brooks will face the full consequences of his actions, and we will implement whatever reforms you recommend to prevent similar incidents. Ethan nodded slowly. I appreciate that, Chief Stone, but this goes beyond one officer's misconduct. This represents systemic issues that require systemic solutions. As he spoke, phones throughout the booking area began ringing with increasing urgency. The story was spreading beyond social media now, picked up by news outlets and federal agencies. Within hours, it would be front-page news across the country. Within days, it would become a case study in police reform and federal-local law enforcement cooperation. But for now, it was just one man's mistake that had revealed the fault lines running through American law enforcement. Fault lines that could no longer be ignored or papered over with good intentions and professional courtesy. Officer Michael Brooks stood in the center of the booking area, his career in ruins, his worldview shattered, finally understanding that some people cannot be arrested without consequences that reach far beyond what any badge can protect against. The reckoning he had set in motion was just beginning. The Internal Affairs Conference Room on the third floor of the downtown precinct had witnessed countless career-ending moments, but few as swift and absolute as the one unfolding now. The room's gray walls and fluorescent lighting created an atmosphere of institutional judgment, while the long conference table seemed to stretch like a bridge between Officer Michael Brooks' past and his rapidly approaching future. Brooks sat alone on one side of the table, his police uniform stripped of badge and weapon, his hands folded in front of him like a defendant awaiting sentencing. Across from him sat a panel that represented the complete dismantling of everything he had thought he understood about law enforcement hierarchy and consequence. Captain Patricia Williams of Internal Affairs occupied the center position, her 25 years of investigating police misconduct evident in the methodical way she arranged her files and recording equipment. To her left sat Deputy Chief Marcus Thompson, whose presence indicated that this investigation had already escalated beyond routine disciplinary action. To her right, Special Agent Catherine Morrison represented federal interests that would ultimately determine whether Brooks faced criminal charges. The fourth chair was occupied by someone Brooks hadn't expected, Commander Sarah Mitchell of the Secret Service Protective Intelligence Division, whose presence transformed this from a local police matter into a federal security investigation. "Officer Brooks," Captain Williams began, her voice carrying the flat professionalism of someone who had conducted this type of interview hundreds of times. "You are being questioned regarding incident number 2024-1847, involving the arrest and assault of a federal official. You have been advised of your rights. Do you understand the charges against you?" Brooks nodded, though his understanding felt fragmentary at best. The events of the past 4 hours seemed surreal, like a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. "Yes, ma'am." "Tell me about your initial contact with Director Walker." The word director still hit Brooks like a physical blow. Even now, hours after the revelation, he struggled to reconcile the man he had arrested with the idea of someone powerful enough to command military colonels and federal agents. In his mind, directors were faceless bureaucrats who worked in air-conditioned offices and attended meetings. They weren't people who walked alone down Pennsylvania Avenue wearing brown trench coats. "I observed a suspicious individual conducting potential surveillance of the White House perimeter," Brooks began, reciting the language he had planned to use in his arrest report. The subject's behavior pattern indicated possible hostile reconnaissance. Commander Mitchell leaned forward. "Describe this suspicious behavior." Brooks felt sweat forming on his forehead, despite the room's air conditioning. When he tried to articulate what had seemed so obvious at the time, the justification sounded thin, even to his own ears. He was walking slowly, observing the area, taking note of security arrangements. He appeared to be memorizing patrol patterns and access points. "Walking slowly," Mitchell repeated. "On a public sidewalk." Yes, but it wasn't normal tourist behavior. He was too focused, too methodical. He kept checking his phone and looking around like he was documenting everything. Agent Morrison consulted her tablet. "Officer Brooks, are you aware that Director Walker walks that route to work every morning? That he has done so for 3 years? That his walking pattern is documented and approved as part of his personal security arrangements?" The question hit Brooks like a sledgehammer. Not only had he arrested the wrong person, he had arrested someone whose daily routine was officially sanctioned by the very security apparatus Brooks claimed to protect. "I know, ma'am. I wasn't aware of that." Furthermore, Morrison continued, Director Walker was checking his secure communication device for updates on current threat assessments. His documentation of the area was actually his job, conducting ongoing security evaluations of the very perimeter you were assigned to protect. The irony was suffocating. Brooks had arrested a man for doing exactly what Brooks himself should have been doing, maintaining awareness of potential security vulnerabilities around the White House. Deputy Chief Thompson spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the political implications of this disaster. "Officer Brooks, what training have you received regarding federal law enforcement coordination?" "Standard Academy training on interagency cooperation, sir." "When was your last refresher on recognizing federal credentials?" Brooks hesitated. The truth was that he had skipped the last 3 mandatory training sessions on federal identification, finding them boring and irrelevant to his street patrol duties. He had been warned twice about missing required training, but had dismissed the warnings as bureaucratic nonsense. "I may have missed some recent updates." Captain Williams made a note in her file. The missed training sessions were already documented in Brooks's personnel record, along with the disciplinary actions that had preceded his transfer to the White House perimeter. What was becoming clear was a pattern of negligence that had culminated in today's disaster. "Officer Brooks," Williams continued, Your personnel file shows 17 hours of missed mandatory training in the past 6 months. This includes sessions on federal identification, de-escalation techniques, and bias recognition. Do you understand how this training might have prevented today's incident? Brooks shifted uncomfortably. The missed training had seemed unimportant at the time. Classroom sessions that pulled him away from real police work. Now he was beginning to understand that those sessions had been designed specifically to prevent the type of catastrophic mistake he had made. Let's discuss your use of force, Williams continued. You struck Director Walker with your expandable baton. Explain the justification for that action. This was the moment Brooks had been dreading. The use of force policies were clear. Weapons could only be deployed when an officer faced imminent threat, or when a subject actively resisted lawful commands. Neither condition had existed during his encounter with Ethan Walker. The subject appeared to be reaching for something, Brooks said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. His hand movement toward his coat pocket suggested he might be armed. According to witness statements, Agent Morrison said, consulting her tablet, Director Walker announced his intention to retrieve his identification and moved slowly with his hands visible at all times. Multiple video recordings confirmed this. He explicitly stated he was reaching for ID. Would you like to review the footage? Brooks' stomach dropped. He had been so focused on making the arrest that he had forgotten about the crowd of tourists with their phones. Now those recordings would be evidence against him in what was clearly becoming a criminal investigation. The subject was being evasive about his identity, Brooks said weakly. In what way? Williams pressed. He claimed to work nearby, but wouldn't specify where. That's typical behavior for someone planning hostile action. Commander Mitchell's expression grew cold. Officer Brooks, Director Walker attempted to show you his identification. You refused to allow him to retrieve it. Then you confiscated it and declared it fraudulent without running any verification checks. Is that correct? The ID looked fake, Brooks insisted. The photo was blurry. The text wasn't clear. It was obviously a counterfeit. Agent Morrison opened her briefcase and withdrew the black leather ID case that had started this entire catastrophe. Officer Brooks, this identification contains security features that cost more to implement than your annual salary. The dynamic text you interpreted as blurry is quantum encryption. The photo quality you questioned includes biometric verification that can only be read by classified scanning equipment. She placed a small device on the table and scanned the ID. Immediately, a three-dimensional hologram appeared above the device, showing not only Ethan Walker's photograph, but also his clearance levels, authorization codes, and a rotating display of security features that were clearly beyond the capability of any counterfeiter. The ID you dismissed as obviously fake, Morrison continued, is one of fewer than 200 issued in the entire United States government. It requires presidential authorization to obtain and congressional oversight to maintain. Brooks stared at the holographic display, finally understanding the magnitude of his error. He had not only arrested an innocent man, he had arrested one of the most highly cleared officials in federal law enforcement. Deputy Chief Thompson leaned forward. Officer Brooks, are you aware that Director Walker personally reviewed your transfer request to White House perimeter duty? That he approved it despite concerns about your disciplinary record? The revelation hit Brooks like a physical blow. Not only had he arrested his ultimate superior, he had arrested someone who had specifically given him the opportunity to work one of the most prestigious assignments in local law enforcement. He knew about me? Director Walker believes in second chances, Agent Morrison said. He felt that officers with troubled pasts could be redeemed through proper supervision and clear expectations. Your assignment to White House duty was his personal initiative to help you rebuild your career. The irony was overwhelming. The man Brooks had brutalized and humiliated was the same man who had advocated for giving him a chance to succeed. The generosity had been repaid with violence and false arrest. Captain Williams opened another file. Let's discuss your radio communications. You ignored multiple directions from dispatch to verify federal credentials before transport. You turned off your radio to avoid further supervision. Explain those decisions. Brooks had no explanation that wouldn't make his situation worse. He had ignored dispatch because he wanted to complete what he saw as a significant arrest without interference. He had turned off his radio because he didn't want to deal with bureaucratic delays. Both actions violated basic police protocols and demonstrated a level of insubordination that would be difficult to defend. "I thought time was critical," he said lamely. "I didn't want to give the subject time to contact potential associates or destroy evidence." "Time was critical for what?" Commander Mitchell asked. Director Walker was cooperating fully. He posed no flight risk and no immediate danger. What emergency justified ignoring proper procedures? The question exposed the fundamental flaw in Brooks's thinking. There had been no emergency except the one he had created in his own mind. His actions had been driven not by professional necessity but by personal prejudice and the desire to make an impressive arrest. Agent Morrison leaned back in her chair, studying Brooks with the clinical interest of someone observing a particularly instructive failure. "Officer Brooks, do you understand the national security implications of your actions today?" Brooks looked confused. "Ma'am?" Director Walker was returning from a classified briefing regarding current threats to the president. His arrest and detention delayed critical security updates by 4 hours. His secured communication device was damaged when you knocked it from his hands. Ongoing protective operations had to be modified because the director was unavailable to authorize routine protocols. She paused, letting the implications sink in before continuing. A motorcade route had to be changed because Director Walker couldn't confirm security arrangements. 3 diplomatic events required additional screening because updated threat assessments were delayed. The president's schedule was modified because protective intelligence was incomplete. The scope of the disaster was expanding beyond Brooks's ability to comprehend. He had not only committed assault against a federal official, he had disrupted national security operations in ways that could have cascading effects across multiple agencies. "I didn't know," he whispered. "That's precisely the problem," Deputy Chief Thompson said. "You didn't know because you didn't follow procedures designed to prevent exactly this type of incident. You didn't know because you ignored training requirements. You didn't know because you prioritized your assumptions over professional protocols." Commander Mitchell opened her own file. "Officer Brooks, this incident has already triggered reviews in 17 different agencies. The Department of Homeland Security is conducting a security assessment of all local law enforcement assigned to federal facilities. The Secret Service is reviewing its cooperation agreements with local police departments. Congress has been briefed on the incident and is considering oversight hearings." Brooks felt the room spinning around him. His single arrest was somehow triggering investigations and reviews throughout the entire federal law enforcement apparatus. Agent Morrison stood, gathering her materials. "Officer Brooks, you should understand that this incident will become a case study in federal law enforcement training programs. Your actions today will be analyzed by thousands of officers as an example of how personal bias can lead to professional destruction and potential criminal liability." Captain Williams gathered her files, the sound of papers rustling seeming to echo in the silence of the conference room. "Officer Brooks, based on the evidence presented today, I am recommending your immediate termination from the Metropolitan Police Department. Federal charges are being considered by the U.S. Attorney's Office. Your case will be referred to the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice for review." Brooks felt his world collapsing. Career destruction was one thing, but federal prison was another level of consequence entirely. "Captain, please, I made a mistake, but I was trying to protect." "You made multiple mistakes," Commander Mitchell interrupted. "You profiled a citizen based on race. You used excessive force against a non-threatening individual. You falsified arrest justifications. You ignored supervisory orders. You disrupted federal security operations. Any one of these actions would be serious. Together they constitute a pattern of behavior that cannot be tolerated in any law enforcement officer." Deputy Chief Thompson stood to leave. "Officer Brooks, the FBI Civil Rights Division will be interviewing you within 48 hours. The U.S. Attorney's Office is reviewing charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, which carries a maximum penalty of 10 years in federal prison. I strongly advise you to retain qualified legal counsel immediately." The meeting was ending. but Brooks felt like he was drowning in the implications of what had occurred. What happens now? Now, Thompson continued, you retain an attorney and prepare for the consequences of your choices. The department will cooperate fully with federal investigators. Your personal effects will be returned to you, but you are banned from all police facilities pending resolution of criminal charges. Agent Morrison paused at the door. Officer Brooks, Director Walker has declined to pursue civil litigation against you personally. He believes that federal criminal prosecution will be sufficient to address the constitutional violations involved. Consider yourself fortunate that he's chosen to focus on systemic reform rather than personal revenge. As the panel filed out of the conference room, Brooks remained seated, staring at the empty chairs where his judges had pronounced sentence on his career and possibly his freedom. The man he had seen as a suspicious individual had turned out to be someone whose single phone call could mobilize federal agencies and military commands. The arrest he had thought would enhance his reputation had instead revealed him as exactly the kind of officer that professional law enforcement was trying to eliminate. His phone buzzed with notifications, social media alerts, news requests, messages from colleagues expressing shock and disappointment. The teenager's live stream had been viewed over 2 million times now. News outlets were calling it the White House arrest video, and his name was trending alongside hashtags about police brutality and racial profiling. By tomorrow, his photograph would appear in newspapers across the country as an example of everything wrong with American policing. Within a week, his actions would be discussed in Congress as justification for federal oversight of local law enforcement. Congressional representatives were already calling for hearings on police training and accountability. The irony was complete and devastating. Officer Michael Brooks had wanted to make a name for himself in law enforcement. He had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, though not in the way he had imagined. His name would indeed be remembered, but as a cautionary tale about the price of prejudice and the consequences of mistaking authority for competence. The investigation was complete, but the reckoning was just beginning. In a few hours, federal prosecutors would begin building a case that could send him to prison for a decade. In a few days, civil rights organizations would use his arrest as a rallying cry for police reform. In a few weeks, his actions would be cited in federal court cases involving police misconduct across the country. Brooks had thought he was making a routine arrest. Instead, he had made history, the wrong kind of history that would follow him for the rest of his life. The Secure Communications Center beneath the J. Edgar Hoover Building hummed with the constant electronic pulse of federal law enforcement coordination. Banks of monitors displayed real-time intelligence feeds from across the globe, while encrypted communication channels carried conversations that could reshape international relations with a single misinterpreted word. It was here, in the heart of America's domestic security apparatus, that the true scope of Officer Michael Brooks' mistake began to unfold like a digital avalanche. Special Agent Patricia Reeves of the FBI's Civil Rights Division sat before a workstation that connected her to every major law enforcement database in the United States. At 43, she had spent 15 years investigating cases of police misconduct, but the file open on her screen represented something unprecedented in her experience. The arrest of a Secret Service director by a local police officer wasn't just a case of excessive force. It was a potential national security breach that required immediate and comprehensive response. Her secure phone rang with the distinctive tone reserved for calls from the highest levels of government. The caller ID displayed only a code that she recognized immediately. The direct line from the Secretary of Homeland Security. "Agent Reeves," she answered, her voice carrying the professional crispness that years of federal service had trained into her. "Patricia, this is Secretary Martinez. I assume you've been briefed on the Walker incident?" Secretary Elena Martinez had held her position for 18 months, rising to the role after a distinguished career in federal law enforcement that had earned her bipartisan respect. But today, her voice carried the strain of someone dealing with a crisis that threatened to expose fundamental weaknesses in the nation's security infrastructure. "Yes, Madam Secretary, I'm coordinating the federal response with Justice. The Civil Rights Division is treating this as a Priority 1 investigation." "Good. But I need you to understand the broader implications here. Director Walker wasn't just assaulted. He was returning from a classified briefing on current threats to the president. His communication device contained intelligence updates that are now compromised. We're looking at potential security breaches that go far beyond civil rights violations. Agent Reeves pulled up the classified threat assessment that had been updated just that morning. What she saw there made her understand why the secretary's voice carried such urgency. There were active investigations into 3 separate potential assassination plots, ongoing surveillance of foreign intelligence operatives, and real-time monitoring of domestic extremist groups that posed immediate threats to federal officials. Madam Secretary, how much of the current threat picture was Director Walker carrying when he was arrested? Everything, Patricia. Presidential protection protocols, current watch lists, ongoing counterintelligence operations. His device was damaged during the arrest, and we don't know if any data was compromised. The implications are staggering. The true magnitude of Brooks's actions was becoming clear. He hadn't just arrested a federal official. He had potentially compromised ongoing national security operations through his incompetence and prejudice. What's the White House response? Reeves asked. The president has been briefed. She's furious, as you might imagine. The idea that racial profiling could lead to a breach of presidential security protocols has implications we're still trying to calculate. The Chief of Staff is demanding a complete review of all local law enforcement cooperation agreements. Agent Reeves began typing rapid notes as the secretary continued. The political ramifications were expanding exponentially. A president known for her commitment to civil rights had been personally endangered by the very type of police misconduct she had campaigned against. Madam Secretary, what's our timeline for federal charges? I want charges filed within 72 hours. Deprivation of rights under color of law, interference with federal operations, potentially assault on a federal official. Make it clear that this type of behavior will face the full force of federal prosecution. As Secretary Martinez hung up, Agent Reeves immediately placed a call to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. The prosecutor who answered, Assistant U.S. Attorney James Chen, had been expecting her call. Patricia, I've been reviewing the evidence all morning. This is the most clear-cut case of police misconduct I've seen in 20 years of prosecution. The video evidence alone is damning. What's your assessment of the charges we can prove? Chen's response was immediate and confident. Deprivation of civil rights under 18 U.S.C. 24-2 is a slam dunk. We have multiple witnesses, video evidence, and clear documentation of excessive force based on racial profiling. The federal interference charges are also solid. He disrupted ongoing national security operations through his actions. What about the national security implications? That's where this gets complicated, Chen admitted. Director Walker's compromised communication device contained classified information. We're looking at potential charges related to compromising federal security operations, even if that wasn't Brooks's intent. Agent Reeves pulled up Brooks' personnel file on her screen. What she found there painted a picture of an officer whose career had been marked by a consistent pattern of racial bias and excessive force. James, this guy's record shows multiple complaints about racial profiling. 3 prior incidents involving excessive force against black suspects. 2 missed court dates for civil rights training. This isn't an isolated incident. That's exactly what makes this prosecutable under federal civil rights statutes, Chen replied. We can demonstrate a pattern of behavior that deprived citizens of their constitutional rights under color of law. The fact that he finally targeted a federal official just makes the case impossible to ignore. Across town, in the Crisis Management Center of the White House, Chief of Staff Margaret Williams was coordinating the administration's response to what was rapidly becoming a national scandal. The room buzzed with the controlled urgency of senior officials dealing with a crisis that threatened to overshadow the president's entire domestic agenda. Where do we stand on media response? Williams asked her communications director. It's everywhere, came the grim reply. The hashtag is trending globally. And White House brutality has been used over 500,000 times in the past 6 hours. International media are picking up the story as an example of American police racism affecting even high-level officials. Williams rubbed her temples. The president had built her political career on promises of police reform and racial justice. Having her own Secret Service director assaulted by a racist cop while protecting her created optics that were almost impossible to manage. What's the president's position? She wants to address this head-on. Full support for Director Walker, commitment to federal prosecution, and a comprehensive review of all local law enforcement cooperation agreements. She's also considering executive action on police reform. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. An administration that had struggled to build consensus around police reform now had a perfect example of why such reform was necessary. The assault on Director Walker could become the catalyst for the most significant federal intervention in local policing in decades. Meanwhile, in the Secret Service Operations Center, Deputy Director Robert Martinez was dealing with the immediate security implications of Walker's compromised communication device. The secure facility buzzed with technicians working to assess what intelligence might have been lost when Walker's phone was damaged during his arrest. What's the damage assessment? Martinez asked his chief technology officer. The device was encrypted, but the physical damage from being dropped and then handled by unauthorized personnel means we have to assume potential compromise, came the troubling reply. We're implementing Protocol 7, complete refresh of all current protection arrangements. Protocol 7 was the most comprehensive security review possible, short of moving the president to a secure bunker. Every route, every schedule, every protection detail would have to be redesigned based on the assumption that current arrangements had been compromised. How long until we're back to full operational security? 48 hours minimum. The president's schedule for the next 2 days will have to be completely revised. 3 public appearances have been canceled, and 2 diplomatic meetings will need to be moved to secure facilities. The economic and political costs of Brooks's actions were mounting exponentially. Presidential schedule changes rippled through diplomatic relations, economic markets, and international agreements. What had started as one officer's racist assault was now affecting global relations. In a secure conference room at the Department of Justice, Attorney General Sarah Thompson was coordinating the federal response with her senior staff. As the nation's chief law enforcement officer, she understood that this case would set precedents for how federal agencies responded to local police misconduct. I want this prosecution to send a clear message, Thompson told her assembled deputies. Federal officials cannot be assaulted by local police based on racial profiling. The constitutional violations here are clear and egregious. Madam Attorney General, asked the head of the Civil Rights Division, what about the broader implications for federal-local cooperation? That's exactly why this case is so important, Thompson replied. We've been trying to build partnerships with local law enforcement, but those partnerships are meaningless if local officers can assault federal officials based on racial bias. This prosecution will establish clear boundaries. The Attorney General's secure phone buzzed with an incoming call from the White House. President Catherine Hernandez herself was on the line, and her voice carried the steel of someone who had built her career fighting for civil rights. Sarah, I want you to understand how seriously I'm taking this incident. Director Walker is one of our most capable officials, and the idea that he could be assaulted by a police officer while doing his job protecting me is unacceptable. Yes, Madam President, we're treating this as a priority prosecution. I want more than prosecution, Sarah. I want this case to be an example of why we need comprehensive police reform. I'm considering federal legislation that would mandate bias training for any local officer working near federal facilities. The political implications were becoming clear. The assault on Director Walker could become the foundation for the most significant federal intervention in local policing in a generation. Back in the downtown precinct, Officer Michael Brooks sat in the break room, his career in ruins, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had set in motion. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, news requests, social media mentions, messages from colleagues expressing shock and disappointment. The live stream video had now been viewed over 3 million times. News outlets were calling it the White House arrest video, and legal experts were already analyzing it as a textbook example of racial profiling and excessive force. Congressional representatives were demanding hearings on police accountability. Brooks tried calling his union representative, but the response was devastating. "Mike, we can't represent you on this one. The video evidence is too clear, the victim is too high profile, and the constitutional violations are too obvious. You're going to need private counsel, and even then, your chances aren't good." The union's abandonment hit Brooks like a physical blow. For the first time since his arrest of Walker, he was truly alone with the consequences of his actions. His phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. When he answered, the voice on the other end was crisp and professional. "Officer Brooks, this is Assistant U.S. Attorney James Chen. I'm calling to inform you that federal charges will be filed against you within 72 hours. You have the right to representation, and I strongly advise you to retain qualified counsel immediately." What charges? Brooks managed to ask. Deprivation of civil rights, under color of law, interference with federal operations, and assault on a federal official. The maximum penalty is 10 years in federal prison. Do you have an attorney? Brooks' world was spinning. Federal prison. 10 years. His life was over, destroyed by 15 minutes of prejudice and violence. "I know I don't have an attorney." Mr. Brooks, given the seriousness of these charges and the media attention this case is receiving, I recommend you contact a criminal defense attorney with experience in federal civil rights cases immediately. The charges will be filed whether you have representation or not. As Chen hung up, Brooks sat in the empty break room, finally understanding that his actions had triggered something far beyond what he could have imagined. He hadn't just arrested the wrong person. He had assaulted one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the federal government, while that official was carrying classified information critical to national security. The phone call had made everything real. Federal charges, federal prison, his name forever associated with police brutality and racial profiling. The arrest he had thought would make his career had instead made him a symbol of everything wrong with American policing. Outside the precinct, news vans were gathering. Reporters were already crafting stories about the racist cop who assaulted the Secret Service director. By evening, his photograph would be on every major news network in America. Brooks looked at his reflection in the break room's dirty mirror and saw not a police officer, but a man whose prejudice had destroyed not only his own life, but had potentially compromised national security and damaged relationships between federal and local law enforcement. The phone call from the prosecutor had been brief, but its message was clear. The full weight of the federal government was about to come down on Officer Michael Brooks, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The reckoning he had set in motion with his baton strike against Ethan Walker was now an unstoppable force that would reshape his life, his career, and possibly the entire relationship between federal and local law enforcement. Federal prosecutors were building their case. Congressional representatives were demanding hearings. The president was considering executive action on police reform, all because one officer had seen a black man near the White House and decided that was enough justification for violence. The call had been made. The consequences were now inevitable. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pennsylvania Avenue as an unprecedented convoy of federal vehicles converged on the downtown precinct. What had started as a single officer's mistake was now triggering the largest federal response to a local police incident in Washington, D.C. history. The sight of unmarked sedans, FBI mobile command units, Secret Service protective details, and Department of Homeland Security tactical vehicles descending on the modest precinct building sent ripples of concern through the entire Metropolitan Police Department. Chief of Police Margaret Stone stood at her office window on the 4th floor, watching the federal takeover of her jurisdiction with a mixture of professional dread and personal embarrassment. In 30 years of law enforcement, she had never seen federal agencies mobilize so quickly or comprehensively in response to a single arrest. The convoy below represented every major federal law enforcement agency, and their presence sent a clear message. Officer Michael Brooks' actions had crossed lines that could not be uncrossed. Black SUVs with government plates lined the street like a presidential motorcade. FBI evidence response teams were unloading equipment that belonged in major terrorism investigations, not routine police misconduct cases. The Secret Service had established a perimeter around the building that included counter-surveillance teams and communication jammers. Even the U.S. Marshal Service had sent personnel to ensure the security of federal evidence. "Chief," her deputy knocked and entered without waiting for permission, his face pale with stress. "We have federal agents requesting immediate access to all records related to Officer Brooks. FBI, Secret Service, Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Attorney's Office, Civil Rights Division, and now the Inspector General's Office." Stone turned from the window, her face grim with the realization that her department was about to undergo the most comprehensive federal investigation in its history. How many agents? 23 so far, with more arriving every hour. They've established a command post in the parking garage and are requesting conference room space for interviews. The lead agent says they'll need to speak with everyone who had contact with the Walker arrest, plus anyone who supervised or worked with Brooks in the past 5 years. The scope of the federal response was staggering. Stone had dealt with federal investigations before, but nothing approaching this level of urgency and manpower. The message was unmistakable. The federal government was treating Brooks's assault on Director Walker as a national security incident with implications far beyond routine police misconduct. "Ma'am," the deputy continued, "they're also requesting access to our internal affairs files, training records, and all body camera footage from the past year. The FBI wants to interview you personally about departmental policies regarding racial bias and federal cooperation." Stone understood immediately what was happening. This wasn't just an investigation of Brooks's misconduct. It was a comprehensive audit of her department's policies, training, and culture. The federal government was using Brooks's assault on Walker as justification for the kind of deep intervention in local policing that civil rights advocates had been demanding for decades. 3 floors below, Special Agent Patricia Reeves was establishing the FBI's command center in the precinct's largest conference room. The space quickly filled with laptops, secure communication equipment, digital forensics tools, and boxes of evidence that had been gathered in the 8 hours since Walker's arrest. The efficiency of the federal response demonstrated capabilities that local law enforcement could barely imagine. Reeves had assembled a task force that included specialists in civil rights enforcement, counterintelligence, digital forensics, and federal prosecution coordination. The resources being devoted to this single case were typically reserved for major terrorism investigations or organized crime prosecutions. Agent Reeves, her deputy, approached with a tablet full of preliminary findings. "We've completed the initial review of Officer Brooks' personnel file. What we found is deeply disturbing and suggests systemic failures throughout the department." Reeves looked up from her laptop, where she was coordinating with federal prosecutors, congressional liaisons, White House staff, and international security partners simultaneously. The case was developing tentacles that reached into every aspect of federal law enforcement. What kind of disturbing? Brooks has 23 documented complaints of racial bias over 8 years, not 17 as initially reported. 6 excessive force incidents involving black suspects. 4 lawsuits settled quietly by the city with non-disclosure agreements. Missed bias training sessions totaling over 40 hours. Failed psychological evaluations that were ignored by supervisors. 2 formal recommendations for dismissal that were overruled by union intervention. The implications hit Reeves immediately. This wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. It was the predictable culmination of years of documented misconduct that had been systematically ignored, covered up, or excused by multiple levels of supervision. The federal case against Brooks was becoming stronger by the hour, but more importantly, it was revealing institutional failures that justified federal intervention. Who approved his assignment to White House perimeter duty with this record? Reeves asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "That's what makes this even worse," her deputy replied, consulting his notes. According to the files, Director Walker himself signed off on Brooks's assignment. Walker specifically noted the disciplinary issues, but recommended giving Brooks a second chance under close federal supervision. Walker wrote a personal memo stating that he believed problem officers could be redeemed through proper mentorship and clear expectations. The irony was breathtaking in its cruelty. The man Brooks had assaulted was the same man who had advocated for giving him an opportunity to redeem his troubled career. Walker's generosity and belief in second chances had been repaid with violence and humiliation in full view of international media. There's more, the deputy continued. Walker also established a personal mentorship program for officers with disciplinary issues. Brooks was supposed to meet with a Secret Service supervisor monthly for guidance and evaluation. He missed his last 4 appointments. Reeves shook her head in disgust. Even when given extraordinary support and opportunity for redemption, Brooks had failed to take advantage of it. His assault on Walker wasn't just criminal. It was a betrayal of trust that made the charges even more serious. Across the precinct, in interview room 3, Assistant U.S. Attorney James Chen was preparing for what would become the most politically significant prosecution of his career. The evidence against Brooks was overwhelming, but Chen understood that this case would be scrutinized by Congress, the media, civil rights organizations, and international observers. Every procedure had to be perfect. Every charge had to be airtight. "Sir," his paralegal entered with a stack of documents and digital storage devices. "We have the complete video evidence package, 27 different angles from tourist phones, security cameras, news crews, and the live stream that's now been viewed over 5 million times. We also have audio recordings from police radio traffic and witness statements from 43 individuals." Chen reviewed the video compilation on his laptop, watching the assault from multiple angles simultaneously. The evidence was devastating for any potential defense. Every angle showed the same sequence: an unprovoked baton strike against a cooperating individual, followed by an arrest based entirely on racial profiling. No competent defense attorney would want to take this case to trial. "What's our timeline for the grand jury?" Chen asked. "Federal grand jury has been scheduled for Friday morning. Given the evidence quality and the national security implications, we expect indictments on all charges. The grand jurors have already been briefed on the classification levels involved." The federal machinery was moving with unprecedented speed. Normally, civil rights cases took months or years to develop, but the assault on a Secret Service director, while carrying classified information, had triggered emergency protocols that compressed the usual timeline into days. "Are we coordinating with state prosecutors?" Chen asked. "Yes, sir. The district attorney's office is preparing parallel state charges for assault, false arrest, and official misconduct. They want to ensure Brooks faces consequences even if federal jurisdiction issues arise." At the Secret Service headquarters building, 6 miles away, Director Ethan Walker was holding his first senior staff meeting since the incident. His brown trench coat had been replaced with a crisp navy suit, but the bruises from Brooks' baton were still visible on his neck and shoulder. The attack had been deeply personal, but Walker's response was entirely professional and focused on institutional improvement. "The incident this morning has exposed critical vulnerabilities in our local law enforcement partnerships," Walker began, addressing his senior staff in the secure conference room. "We need a complete review of all cooperation agreements with municipal police departments nationwide." Deputy Director Martinez raised a concern that had been troubling the entire protective detail. "Sir, the compromised communication device contained current threat assessments, ongoing surveillance operations, and real-time intelligence updates. Are we looking at protocol changes for all protection details?" "Absolutely. We're implementing new security measures for all senior staff, effective immediately. Personal devices will have enhanced encryption. Backup communication systems will be standard for anyone carrying classified information, and we're establishing new protocols for interaction with local law enforcement." Walker paused, considering the broader implications of Brooks' actions on federal security operations. "But I want everyone to understand something important. This incident, as unfortunate and personally painful as it was, provides us with an unprecedented opportunity to address systemic issues that have been ignored for too long." The room fell silent as Walker continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had transformed personal trauma into institutional reform. Officer Brooks didn't wake up this morning planning to assault a federal official. He acted based on ingrained biases that were allowed to flourish despite multiple warning signs over 8 years. His supervisors failed him, his training failed him, The system failed him, and ultimately that failure endangered national security. Walker's analysis was characteristic of his approach to leadership, using even personal attacks as opportunities for institutional improvement. We're going to use this incident to strengthen partnerships with professional law enforcement, while identifying and eliminating officers whose biases make them security risks to federal operations. The director pulled up a presentation on the conference room screen. I've been authorized by the Secretary of Homeland Security to establish new federal standards for any local law enforcement officer working within 1 mile of federal facilities. Mandatory bias training, enhanced background checks, regular psychological evaluations, and direct federal oversight of performance. The scope of the proposed changes was revolutionary. Walker was essentially federalizing aspects of local law enforcement that had never been subject to federal control. Back at the precinct, the federal investigation was expanding to include interviews with every officer who had worked with Brooks over the past 5 years. Detective Lisa Chen found herself in interview room 2, facing questions from Agent Reeves and 2 civil rights attorneys that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Detective Chen, how many times did you personally witness Officer Brooks make racially biased comments or decisions? Agent Reeves asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone conducting a criminal investigation. Chen shifted in her chair, understanding that her answers could affect her own career and the future of her department. The truth was that Brooks' racist attitudes had been an open secret throughout the department. Officers had joked about his instincts for stopping black suspects, and supervisors had quietly counseled him to be more careful with his language in public. Agent Reeves, Brooks had some problematic attitudes, but we thought working the White House perimeter under federal supervision would help him develop more professional standards. Can you provide specific examples of these problematic attitudes? Chen hesitated. Providing specific examples would implicate other officers who had witnessed Brooks's behavior and failed to report it. He made comments about black suspects that were inappropriate, but nothing that seemed actionable at the time. Detective, did anyone formally report his racist comments or behavior? The question exposed the uncomfortable reality of police culture that Chen had been dreading. Officers rarely reported colleagues for bias, even when that bias led to misconduct. The thin blue line protected racist cops as effectively as it protected honest ones. No formal reports were filed, Chen admitted, but supervisors were aware he had issues. There were informal counseling sessions and warnings. Agent Reeves made detailed notes, understanding that she was documenting not just individual misconduct, but a culture that enabled and protected racist officers. The implications for federal oversight of local law enforcement were becoming clear. Detective Chen, are you aware that failing to report civil rights violations by fellow officers is itself a federal crime under Section 2? Chen's face went pale. She was beginning to understand that the federal investigation might implicate multiple officers and supervisors who had knowledge of Brooks' behavior and failed to take action. In the break room where Brooks had received his devastating phone call from the federal prosecutor, a different conversation was taking place. Sergeant Rodriguez was explaining to his shift supervisor why he had felt uncomfortable processing Brooks's arrest of Walker. Something felt wrong from the moment they walked in, Rodriguez told Captain Hayes. The guy Brooks arrested didn't act like someone who belonged in handcuffs. He was too calm, too confident, too familiar with police procedures, like he knew something we didn't. Captain Hayes was reviewing the federal requirements that had arrived that morning. Tom, we're all going to be interviewed by federal agents. They want to know how Brooks's arrest was processed, who had contact with Walker, why no one recognized him, and whether our procedures contributed to the incident. Cap, how were we supposed to recognize him? Secret Service directors don't exactly walk around wearing name tags, but looking back, there were signs. The way he carried himself, the quality of his clothes, his reaction to being arrested. He wasn't angry or scared. He was disappointed. Hayes understood the dilemma, but he also understood the federal perspective. The problem isn't that we didn't recognize him. The problem is that Brooks arrested him. based on nothing but racial profiling, and our systems failed to catch that before it became an international incident. The federal interviews were revealing the casual nature of Brooks' racism and the systemic failures that had allowed it to flourish. Each conversation painted a picture of an officer whose biases were well known but never formally addressed, protected by a culture that prioritized loyalty over accountability. At the White House, President Catherine Hernandez was receiving her third briefing of the day on the Walker incident. Chief of Staff Williams had assembled the administration's senior team to discuss the political and policy implications of what was rapidly becoming a defining moment for federal-local law enforcement relations. Madam President, Attorney General Thompson reported via secure video conference, "Federal charges will be filed tomorrow morning. We have overwhelming evidence of civil rights violations, and this case will send the clearest possible message about federal response to racially motivated police misconduct." President Hernandez leaned forward in her chair, her expression determined. "Sarah, I want more than just prosecution. I want this incident to be the catalyst for comprehensive reform. Can we use this to push federal oversight of local law enforcement?" "Yes, Madam President. The assault on Director Walker while he was carrying classified information gives us unassailable national security justification for federal intervention. We can mandate federal standards for any local officers working near federal facilities, require federal approval for assignments, and establish direct oversight of training and performance." The political opportunity was unprecedented. An administration that had struggled to build consensus around police reform now had a perfect example of why such reform was necessary. The assault on Director Walker could justify the most significant federal intervention in local policing since the civil rights era. As the afternoon wore on, the federal presence at the precinct continued to grow beyond anything the building had been designed to accommodate. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents arrived to review Brooks' arrest patterns for potential violations of immigrant rights. The Civil Rights Division sent additional attorneys to coordinate with state prosecutors and civil rights organizations. The State Department sent representatives to assess diplomatic implications of the incident. Even the Defense Department sent liaisons to evaluate impacts on military-police cooperation agreements. The message was unmistakable. Officer Michael Brooks' assault on Director Walker had transcended local law enforcement and become a federal priority that would be prosecuted with the full resources of the United States government. In interview room 1, Brooks sat across from 5 federal agents representing different agencies, finally beginning to understand that his actions had triggered something far beyond what he could have imagined. The arrest he had thought would enhance his reputation had instead made him the face of police racism and the target of the most comprehensive federal prosecution for police misconduct in decades. The federal agents were professional but relentless. Every aspect of Brooks' 8-year career was being scrutinized with forensic precision. Every arrest was being reviewed for racial bias. Every use of force was being analyzed for constitutional violations. Every report was being examined for false statements. "Officer Brooks," Agent Reeves concluded the 4-hour interview, "your actions today have triggered federal investigations that will continue for months and potentially reshape federal-local law enforcement relationships nationwide. You should understand that this case will be used as a precedent for how the federal government responds to racially motivated police misconduct." As the federal agents left the interview room, Brooks remained seated, finally understanding that he had not just destroyed his own career. He had potentially changed the entire relationship between federal and local law enforcement. His prejudice had given the federal government justification for intervention in local policing that civil rights advocates had been seeking for decades. The arrival of federal agents had transformed a local police incident into a national crisis that would be studied in law schools, analyzed in congressional hearings, and cited in federal court cases for generations. Officer Michael Brooks had wanted to make his mark in law enforcement. He had succeeded, but as the catalyst for the most significant federal intervention in local policing since the 1960s, his baton strike against Ethan Walker would be remembered not as good police work, but as the moment when federal patience with local police racism finally ran out. The federal arrival was complete. The reckoning was now inevitable and would reshape American law enforcement forever. The East Room of the White House had hosted presidents, prime ministers, and world leaders throughout American history, but rarely had it witnessed a moment as transformative as the one unfolding at 3:47 p.m. on what would forever be known as the day American policing changed forever. President Catherine Hernandez stood behind the presidential podium, flanked by Attorney General Sarah Thompson, Secretary of Homeland Security Elena Martinez, and Director Ethan Walker himself, whose presence sent an unmistakable message about the federal government's response to police misconduct. The assembled press corps filled every available seat, with international media outlets broadcasting live to audiences across the globe. The story of a racist police officer assaulting the nation's top security official had captured worldwide attention as a symbol of America's ongoing struggle with racial bias in law enforcement. Ladies and gentlemen, President Hernandez began, her voice carrying the weight of moral authority that had defined her political career. This morning, one of our nation's most dedicated public servants was brutally assaulted by a police officer whose actions represent everything that is wrong with American law enforcement. The room fell silent as the president continued, her words carefully chosen to resonate far beyond the White House press room. Director Ethan Walker was returning from a classified briefing designed to protect my life and the lives of every American when he was attacked without provocation, handcuffed without justification, and treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin. Behind the podium, Director Walker stood with quiet dignity, the bruises on his neck visible despite the professional makeup applied for the cameras. His presence at the press conference was itself a statement. He would not be intimidated into silence by Brooks's assault. But this incident, the president continued, represents more than just one officer's misconduct. It represents systemic failures that have allowed racial bias to flourish in law enforcement for far too long. Today we say enough. The president paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle, before delivering the announcement that would reshape American policing. I am signing an executive order establishing federal oversight of any local law enforcement officer working within proximity of federal facilities. No officer with a documented history of racial bias will be permitted to work in partnership with federal agencies. The press room erupted with questions, but President Hernandez continued without acknowledging the commotion. Furthermore, I am directing the Department of Justice to conduct a comprehensive review of all federal-local law enforcement cooperation agreements. Any department that fails to meet federal standards for bias training and accountability will lose all federal funding and cooperation. The political earthquake was immediate and far-reaching. The president was using Brooks's assault on Walker to justify the most significant federal intervention in local policing since the civil rights era. Police departments across the country would now be subject to federal oversight in ways that had been politically impossible just hours earlier. Attorney General Thompson stepped to the podium to announce the criminal charges that would make Brooks a symbol of police accountability. This afternoon, federal charges were filed against Officer Michael Brooks. He is charged with deprivation of civil rights under color of law, interference with federal operations, assault on a federal official, and compromising national security operations. The charges carried a maximum sentence of 25 years in federal prison, making clear that the federal government was treating Brooks's assault on Walker as seriously as major terrorism offenses. These charges, Thompson continued, send a clear message to law enforcement officers across America. Racial bias will not be tolerated, and those who violate citizens' constitutional rights will face the full force of federal prosecution. Secretary Martinez approached the podium to address the national security implications that had transformed this from a civil rights case into a matter of homeland security. Director Walker was carrying classified information critical to presidential protection when he was assaulted. Officer Brooks's actions compromised ongoing security operations and forced the modification of protective protocols at a cost of over $6 million. The economic impact was staggering, but the security implications were even more serious. Martinez revealed that the president's schedule had been modified, diplomatic meetings had been canceled, and protective details had been reassigned because of intelligence compromised during Walker's arrest. This incident demonstrates why we cannot allow racial bias to exist in any law enforcement officer working with federal security operations. Martinez concluded, "Prejudice is not just morally wrong, It is a national security threat. Director Walker finally stepped to the podium, his first public statement since the assault. The room fell completely silent as he began to speak, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had dedicated his life to protecting others. This morning, I was assaulted not because I posed any threat, but because Officer Brooks saw a black man near the White House and decided that was sufficient justification for violence, Walker said, his words measured but carrying unmistakable steel. His actions were not the result of poor training or honest mistakes. They were the predictable outcome of racial bias that has been documented, reported, and ignored for 8 years. Walker's analysis was devastating in its precision. Officer Brooks had 23 documented complaints of racial bias, 6 excessive force incidents involving black suspects, 4 civil rights lawsuits settled by taxpayers, missed training sessions totaling over 40 hours, failed psychological evaluations, 2 formal recommendations for dismissal. The litany of failures painted a picture of systematic negligence that went far beyond individual misconduct. Yet he was assigned to work the White House perimeter, one of the most sensitive security zones in America. This assignment was approved despite clear warning signs that should have disqualified him from any federal cooperation. Walker paused, his next words carrying personal weight. I personally advocated for giving Officer Brooks a second chance. I believed that problem officers could be redeemed through proper supervision and mentorship. I was wrong. Some officers cannot be reformed, and the system that protects them must be dismantled. The director's admission was remarkable. A senior federal official taking personal responsibility for a decision that had led to his own assault. But it also demonstrated the depth of institutional failure that had enabled Brooks's misconduct. Today marks the end of federal tolerance for local police racism, Walker concluded. Any officer who cannot serve all citizens with equal respect and dignity has no place in American law enforcement. As the press conference concluded, reporters immediately began filing stories that would dominate news cycles for weeks. The federal response to Brooks's assault was being portrayed as a watershed moment in police accountability, with international media describing it as America finally confronting systemic racism in law enforcement. Meanwhile, at the downtown precinct, the revelation of federal charges was creating chaos throughout the department. Officers who had worked with Brooks were being interviewed by federal agents, their own careers potentially at risk for failing to report his misconduct. The culture of protecting problematic officers was colliding with federal investigation techniques that left no stone unturned. Captain Hayes found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining to FBI agents why he had repeatedly approved Brooks for sensitive assignments, despite documented bias complaints. Agent Reeves, we thought the disciplinary actions and counseling were sufficient. Brooks seemed to respond well to supervision. Captain, did you personally review the nature of the bias complaints against Brooks? Hayes shifted uncomfortably. The truth was that he had treated the complaints as administrative paperwork rather than warning signs of serious misconduct. The complaints were investigated and addressed through proper channels. Were you aware that 4 of the complaints involved Brooks using racial slurs during arrests? The question exposed the casual nature of the department's response to racist behavior. Hayes had known about the slurs but had treated them as unprofessional language rather than evidence of constitutional violations. We counseled Officer Brooks about appropriate communication with suspects, Hayes replied weakly. Agent Reeves made detailed notes. The federal investigation was revealing that Brooks' misconduct had been enabled by supervisors who failed to understand the seriousness of racial bias in policing. In interview room 3, Detective Chen was facing increasingly uncomfortable questions about her knowledge of Brooks' behavior and her failure to report it. Detective Chen, you stated that Brooks made inappropriate comments about black suspects. Can you provide specific examples? Chen hesitated, understanding that her answers could implicate her in federal charges for failing to report civil rights violations. He would say things like black suspects were more likely to be dangerous, that they required more forceful approaches. But these were casual comments, not official policies. Did you understand that such comments indicated racial bias that could lead to constitutional violations? The question forced Chen to confront her own complicity in enabling Brooks's misconduct. She had known his attitudes were problematic, but had failed to recognize them as civil rights violations that required reporting. "I thought the comments were unprofessional, but I didn't realize they constituted federal crimes," Chen admitted. Agent Reeves consulted her notes. "Detective, were you aware that failing to report known civil rights violations by fellow officers is itself a federal offense punishable by up to 10 years in prison?" Chen's face went pale as she realized the extent of her potential legal exposure. The federal investigation was revealing that Brooks's misconduct had been enabled by multiple officers and supervisors who had knowledge of his bias and failed to take action. At the federal courthouse 6 blocks away, Assistant U.S. Attorney James Chen was preparing the most significant civil rights prosecution of his career. The evidence against Brooks was overwhelming, but the case would be scrutinized by defense attorneys, civil rights organizations, and international observers. "We have video evidence from 27 different angles," Chen told his prosecution team. "Witness statements from 46 individuals, audio recordings of police radio traffic, digital forensics from Brooks' communication devices, and classified intelligence reports documenting the national security implications." The evidence package was unprecedented in its comprehensiveness. The federal government was bringing resources typically reserved for major terrorism prosecutions to ensure that Brooks faced accountability for his assault on Walker. "What's our timeline for trial?" asked the lead prosecutor. "Given the evidence quality and the defendant's documented history of misconduct, we expect a guilty plea within 30 days, Chen replied. "No competent defense attorney will want to take this case to trial with video evidence this clear." But the prosecution team understood that Brooks' case was about more than individual accountability. It would establish precedents for federal intervention in local policing that would reshape law enforcement across the country. Back at the Secret Service headquarters, Director Walker was holding an emergency meeting with his senior staff to address the security implications of his assault and the federal response it had triggered. "The incident this morning has provided us with an opportunity to implement reforms that have been needed for years," Walker told his assembled team. "Sir," asked Deputy Director Martinez, "what's the scope of the new federal oversight requirements?" Walker pulled up a presentation outlining the comprehensive changes that would result from his assault. Any local law enforcement officer working within 1 mile of federal facilities will now be subject to federal background checks, bias training requirements, and ongoing performance monitoring. Officers with documented histories of racial bias will be immediately disqualified from federal cooperation. The changes were revolutionary in scope. Local police departments would now be subject to federal oversight in ways that had been politically impossible before Brooks's assault provided justification. Furthermore, Walker continued, "We're establishing a federal database of officers with substantiated bias complaints. This information will be shared with all federal agencies to prevent problematic officers from being assigned to sensitive positions. The database would end the practice of problem officers moving between departments without their misconduct histories following them." It represented a fundamental shift toward accountability that civil rights advocates had been demanding for decades. At his home in suburban Virginia, Officer Michael Brooks was experiencing the complete collapse of his world. The federal charges had been announced on national television. His name was trending on social media platforms worldwide, and his photograph was appearing on news broadcasts as a symbol of police racism. His wife, Jennifer, had taken their 2 children to her mother's house after reporters began gathering outside their home. His police pension had been suspended pending the outcome of federal charges. His union had formally declined to provide legal representation, citing the overwhelming evidence against him. Brooks sat alone in his living room, watching news coverage of the president's press conference and finally understanding the magnitude of what he had set in motion. His 15 minutes of prejudice had triggered federal intervention in local policing that would affect law enforcement across America for generations. The phone rang with a call from his court-appointed federal public defender. "Mr. Brooks, this is Attorney Sarah Williams. I've been assigned to represent you in the federal criminal case. We need to meet immediately to discuss your options." "What options?" Brooks asked. his voice hollow with defeat. "Given the evidence against you and the political climate surrounding this case, I strongly recommend that we negotiate a guilty plea in exchange for a reduced sentence. Taking this case to trial would be professional suicide." The reality was settling in. Brooks would spend years in federal prison. His career was over, and his name would be forever associated with police brutality and racial profiling. The arrest he had thought would enhance his reputation had instead destroyed his life and potentially changed American law enforcement. "How long?" Brooks asked. "With a guilty plea and cooperation with federal investigators, we might negotiate a sentence of 8 to 12 years. Without cooperation, you're looking at the maximum of 25 years. Brooks understood that cooperation would mean providing information about other officers' misconduct, essentially becoming an informant against his former colleagues. But the alternative was spending the rest of his productive life in federal prison. As evening fell over Washington, D.C., the full scope of the revelation was becoming clear. Brooks's assault on Walker had provided the federal government with justification for the most comprehensive intervention in local policing since the civil rights era. Police departments across the country would now be subject to federal oversight. Officers with bias histories would be permanently disqualified from federal cooperation, and racial profiling would face prosecution with the full resources of the federal government. The revelation was complete. One officer's moment of prejudice had triggered changes that would reshape American law enforcement for generations. Brooks had wanted to make his mark in policing. He had succeeded, but as the catalyst for reforms that would ensure officers like him could never again assault citizens based on racial bias. The president's executive order was already being implemented by federal agencies. Congressional hearings were being scheduled to examine systemic racism in law enforcement. Civil rights organizations were celebrating the most significant federal action on police accountability in decades. Officer Michael Brooks' name would indeed be remembered in law enforcement history, not as a hero, but as the racist cop whose assault on Director Walker finally forced America to confront the cancer of bias in policing. The revelation of federal intervention was complete, and there would be no going back. 6 months after Officer Michael Brooks struck Director Ethan Walker with his baton, the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. witnessed the final chapter of a case that had transformed American law enforcement. The sentencing hearing drew national attention as the culmination of the most significant police accountability case in decades, with civil rights leaders, law enforcement officials, and international observers filling every available seat. Brooks sat at the defendant's table in a gray prison uniform, his hands shackled, his face bearing the hollow expression of a man whose single moment of prejudice had destroyed not only his own life, but had triggered sweeping changes across American policing. The officer who had once strutted with the confidence of unchecked authority now appeared broken by the weight of federal prosecution and public condemnation. Judge Maria Castellanos, a respected federal jurist with 25 years of experience in civil rights cases, reviewed the sentencing documents with the gravity befitting a case that would set precedents for generations. The evidence before her painted a devastating picture of systematic misconduct that had been enabled by institutional failures at every level. "Mr. Brooks," Judge Castellanos began, her voice carrying the authority of federal justice, "your assault on Director Walker represents more than individual misconduct. It represents the predictable outcome of racial bias that was documented, reported, and ignored for 8 years. The judge consulted her notes, which detailed every aspect of Brooks' career and the federal investigation that had followed his arrest of Walker. 23 documented complaints of racial bias, 6 excessive force incidents, 4 civil rights lawsuits settled with taxpayer money, missed bias training totaling 47 hours, failed psychological evaluations, 2 formal recommendations for dismissal that were overruled by union intervention. Each fact was delivered with precision, building a comprehensive case for why Brooks' actions were not aberrant behavior, but the inevitable result of a system that protected racist officers. Your personnel file reads like a manual for how not to police in a diverse democracy. Brooks's attorney, Sarah Williams, had negotiated a guilty plea in exchange for cooperation with federal investigators examining systemic bias in the Metropolitan Police Department. The cooperation had revealed additional misconduct by multiple officers and supervisors, leading to 17 federal indictments and the resignation of the police chief. Your Honor, Williams addressed the court. My client accepts full responsibility for his actions and has provided substantial assistance to federal investigators in exposing systemic problems within the department. But Judge Castellanos was not interested in mitigation. Ms. Williams, your client's cooperation cannot undo the damage he caused to constitutional policing, federal security operations, and America's standing in the international community. The judge turned her attention to the impact statements that would inform her sentencing decision. Director Walker himself had submitted a statement that was read aloud by the federal prosecutor. Officer Brooks' assault on me was not just a personal attack. It was an attack on the principles of equal justice and professional law enforcement. His actions endangered ongoing national security operations, compromised classified intelligence, and forced modifications to presidential protection protocols at enormous cost to taxpayers. Walker's statement continued with the measured analysis that had characterized his response throughout the case. But the real damage was not to me personally. The real damage was to the trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve. Brooks' actions confirmed the worst fears of citizens who have experienced police bias, and they undermined the hard work of professional officers who serve all citizens with equal respect. The impact statements from community members were even more powerful. Reverend James Patterson, a civil rights leader who had worked for police reform for 30 years, testified about the broader implications of Brooks' assault. Your Honor, this case represents a turning point in American policing. For decades, officers like Brooks have been protected by a culture that values loyalty over accountability. Director Walker's assault finally forced the system to confront racism that has been ignored for too long. Dr. Angela Thompson, a criminal justice professor at Georgetown University, provided expert analysis of the case's historical significance. Your Honor, the federal response to Officer Brooks' assault has created the most comprehensive police accountability measures since the civil rights era. His actions inadvertently became the catalyst for reforms that will protect citizens' constitutional rights for generations. The federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney James Chen, addressed the court with statistics that demonstrated the case's far-reaching impact. Your Honor, in the 6 months since Brooks' assault on Director Walker, federal oversight has been implemented in 47 police departments nationwide. Over 200 officers with documented bias histories have been removed from federal cooperation agreements. Bias training has become mandatory for any officer working near federal facilities. Chen continued with the economic impact. The total cost of Brooks' 15 minutes of prejudice has exceeded $12 million in modified security protocols, canceled diplomatic events, compromised intelligence operations, and federal oversight implementation. But the most powerful impact statement came from Brooks' own family. His wife, Jennifer, had submitted a written statement that the prosecutor read with evident discomfort. Michael's actions that morning destroyed our family as completely as they destroyed his career. Our children have been bullied at school because their father is known as the racist cop who attacked the Secret Service director. We have received death threats, lost our home, and been forced to relocate to another state. Michael's prejudice didn't just hurt Director Walker, it hurt everyone who loved him. The statement provided a sobering reminder that Brooks' misconduct had consequences that extended far beyond criminal penalties. His children would grow up knowing their father as a symbol of police racism. His wife had been forced to rebuild her life after public association with his crimes. Judge Castellanos reviewed the federal sentencing guidelines, which recommended 12 to 15 years in prison for Brooks' crimes. But she also considered the broader context of a case that had reshaped American law enforcement. Mr. Brooks, the judge addressed the defendant directly. I want you to understand the full scope of what your actions set in motion. Your assault on Director Walker has led to the most comprehensive police reforms in 50 years. Federal oversight of local law enforcement, mandatory bias training, permanent databases tracking officer misconduct, congressional hearings on police accountability. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle before continuing. Your 15 minutes of prejudice triggered changes that will affect every police officer in America for decades to come. You wanted to make your mark in law enforcement. You succeeded. But as the catalyst for reforms designed to ensure that officers like you can never again abuse their authority based on racial bias. Brooks finally spoke, his voice barely audible in the crowded courtroom. Your Honor, I understand the gravity of my actions. I destroyed my own life, hurt my family, and damaged the reputation of law enforcement. I accept full responsibility and ask for the court's mercy. But Judge Castellanos had no mercy for an officer whose documented misconduct had endangered national security and violated constitutional rights. Mr. Brooks, mercy is what you failed to show. Director Walker, when you saw a black man near the White House and decided that justified violence, mercy is what the system failed to show the citizens you mistreated during 8 years of biased policing. The judge announced her sentence with the gravity befitting a case that had captured national attention. You are sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are permanently barred from any law enforcement employment. You will pay restitution in the amount of $12 million for the costs of your misconduct. The sentence was at the high end of federal guidelines, reflecting the judge's determination to send a clear message about accountability for police racism. Brooks would spend the next 15 years in federal prison, emerging as a middle-aged man with no career prospects and a name forever associated with police brutality. As Brooks was led away in shackles, the broader implications of his case continued to unfold across American law enforcement. Police departments nationwide were implementing federal oversight requirements that would have been politically impossible before his assault on Walker provided justification. Chief Rebecca Martinez of the Los Angeles Police Department testified before Congress about the impact of federal reforms triggered by Brooks' case. The federal oversight requirements have forced us to confront bias training, accountability measures, and transparency standards that should have been implemented decades ago. Officer Brooks's assault on Director Walker was a tragedy, but it became the catalyst for necessary reforms. The International Association of Chiefs of Police had initially resisted federal intervention, but was now embracing reforms to avoid the fate of departments that lost federal cooperation. Chief David Johnson of the Chicago Police Department explained the practical impact. We can either meet federal standards voluntarily or lose access to federal resources, intelligence sharing, and joint task force participation. The choice is clear. At the Secret Service headquarters, Director Walker was implementing the most comprehensive security reforms in the agency's history. The protocols developed in response to his assault were being adopted by law enforcement agencies worldwide as models for protecting high-ranking officials. The incident with Officer Brooks taught us that our security is only as strong as our weakest partnership, Walker explained to his senior staff. We can no longer assume that local law enforcement officers have been properly vetted for bias or adequately trained for federal cooperation. The new protocols required federal background checks for any local officer working near federal facilities, mandatory bias training updated annually, and real-time monitoring of officer performance. Departments that failed to meet standards lost all federal cooperation and funding. At the White House, President Hernandez was preparing to sign comprehensive police reform legislation that had passed Congress with bipartisan support, something that would have been impossible without Brooks's assault, providing political cover for federal intervention. The Brooks case demonstrated why federal oversight of local policing is not just morally necessary, but essential for national security, the president explained to congressional leaders. When racial bias compromises federal operations, it becomes a federal responsibility to intervene. The legislation established permanent federal standards for local law enforcement, created a national database of officer misconduct, and provided federal funding for bias training and accountability measures. It represented the most significant police reform since the civil rights era, all triggered by one officer's moment of prejudice. But perhaps the most significant impact was on officers like Brooks, who had operated with impunity for years. The federal database of officer misconduct was identifying problematic officers nationwide, and departments were being forced to choose between accountability and federal funding. Detective Maria Rodriguez of the Phoenix Police Department explained the new reality. The Brooks case changed everything. Officers who used to think their misconduct would be protected by union contracts and departmental culture now understand that federal oversight means real consequences for bias and excessive force. The culture of protecting problematic officers was being dismantled by federal requirements that made departments liable for retaining officers with documented bias histories. Chiefs who had once tolerated racism to avoid confrontation were now implementing zero-tolerance policies to maintain federal partnerships. As Brooks began serving his 15-year sentence at a federal prison in Pennsylvania, letters arrived daily from citizens whose lives had been affected by police bias. Some expressed gratitude that his case had triggered reforms. Others shared their own experiences with racist officers who had never faced consequences. One letter, from a retired teacher in Alabama, captured the sentiment of many. Mr. Brooks, your assault on Director Walker was terrible, but it finally forced America to confront police racism that has existed for too long. Your actions inadvertently became the catalyst for justice that civil rights leaders have been fighting for decades. Brooks would have 15 years to contemplate how his 15 minutes of prejudice had reshaped American law enforcement. His assault on Walker had triggered federal oversight, congressional legislation, international attention, and cultural changes that would protect citizens' constitutional rights for generations. The reckoning was complete. An officer who had thought he could assault a black man without consequences had instead triggered the most comprehensive police accountability measures in American history. His name would be remembered not as a successful cop, but as the racist officer whose prejudice finally forced America to choose between protecting bad cops and protecting constitutional rights. In the end, justice had been served, not just through Brooks's imprisonment, but through systemic changes that would prevent future officers from following his path. The 15-year sentence was just the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape American policing for generations to come. What started with a baton strike against Ethan Walker ended with federal oversight, congressional action, and cultural transformation that protected the constitutional rights of every American citizen. Officer Michael Brooks had indeed made his mark on law enforcement history as the catalyst for the accountability he had tried to avoid. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't see your true worth? Have you ever witnessed injustice that seemed protected by systems designed to avoid accountability? If this story resonated with you, share it. Don't let the lessons of prejudice and accountability be forgotten in the noise of daily life. And if you want to keep hearing stories that challenge, inspire, and demand justice, subscribe. We've got many more stories of accountability and transformation to tell. Because sometimes it takes one person's fall to lift up an entire system of justice. Thank you for following this story to its conclusion. Every share, every comment, every subscription helps ensure that stories of accountability continue to be told when they matter most.